So today I've meticulously pilfered through all the data available, and I've come up to a tier list for the set of Vanguard. Without further ado, let's get into it. At the bottom of our tier list, we have the Abyss. These are decks the game has completely left behind. We have Phantom Blaster Dragon and Touken Ranbu. Touken Ranbu technically takes the bottom 5 slots of this tier list, but for simplicity's sake, I've compiled them into one entry here. All of these decks suffer from having incredibly weak effects that are all insanely costly on resource. Every deck feels like a weaker version of an already meh deck on the tier list. Look at Kiwami and tell me that's not just worst Eugene. Bushiroad clearly didn't want these decks to be serious. They don't even have effect triggers. A good thing about playing this deck is no one knows how the deck works, so you can surprise them with your patheticness. Speaking of pathetic, we have Phantom Blaster Dragon, who at most can give himself plus 10k and a crit, and retire 2 units for the cost of retiring 3 of your units. Let me just remind you of the ever-expanding list of better retiring effects. Most of the support cards this deck has are all focused around trying to get units off top deck to not neg as hard for PBD skill. The only thing keeping this deck above Touken Ranbu is the ability to use generic Keter Sanctuary cards like Fusado, Alden, and effect triggers. Hold on, just wait a bit more for the list to finish. Alright, there we go. This is D. These decks still function. They have severe problems keeping them from being good or commonly performing at events. At the bottom of D tier, we have Wilista. To start off, she's hard locked into 3 attacks. In order for her boards to hit numbers, you have to do insane Yu-Gi-Oh style combos that result in you decking out. These combos are also luck dependent, and you need to see orders and units to either gain value off them or to keep the combo going. I love this deck, but the OK draw power it can have from True-Hearted Ruby and Elvira aren't enough to save it. Overlord might anger people with it being this low, but it's got big problems that can't be ignored. The deck is extremely resource heavy, meaning not seeing soul chargers or having units retired can just turn off this deck's game plan instant. But let's talk about that game plan. At the end of the day, we can break it down into just being 3 attacks. He can attack the Vanguard 3 times, and his skill makes him discard 1 and lose a drive to gain the extra attack against the rear guard. This makes the extra attack essentially worthless outside of 1 extra drive reveal. A lot of the support skills are on hit, which can be problematic against certain decks. You just have to ask the question, what does this deck do against decks that don't need to call real guards immediately, or can just remove theirs after attacking? Decks like Bruce, Kairi, Greedon, and Orfist just fuck this deck shit up. Lastly, in D tier, we have Bavsargra. Yeah, close enough. Whose main problem is the lack of support for the deck. It's got like 6 cards of support total, and what they do have now is pretty solid, and combined with generic Dragon Empire support, it can function as a deck. This deck is a 3 attack deck for now, but we'll see how it develops in future. Equips are a Chad new mechanic, and what they have is genuinely solid. C tier is what I like to refer to as the Storkea tier. Here we have Flagburg, Zorga, Alistiel, and Magnolia. Starting off, we have Flagburg. It's just kind of worse Magnolia. Unlike Magnolia, the deck just hits smaller numbers and has to attack in a specific weaker order, and it still shares one of Magnolia's biggest weaknesses of being super resource heavy. The deck does get 5-minute attacks and guard restrict, and some free units, but a decent player could just deconstruct this deck and easily win. It's got a bit of everything, but it's kind of bad at all of them. Zorga is in a weird spot right now. A lot of its new support wants to lean late game, but the tools it has are so mediocre it's hard to even get there. Almost all of the good orders you run are from set 1 or 2. The only improvement here is the orders are now searchable. Like a lot of Storkea decks, it really feels like design hasn't left set 2, but the deck does have a lot of recursion going for it, and I think that gives it an edge over Flagburg and some of the D tier decks. This brings us what I think is the best Storkea deck, Magnolia. It can pop off with a full field of 6 attacks. This deck calls units off ride line to aggro early. This unit can call units easily thanks to wild intelligence, but if this deck has all that going for it, why does this deck have no results? Well, it's got a variety of problems. First and foremost, it can lose your defensive check at the wrong time. This deck struggles to hit large numbers, so anytime it could become almost free for your opponent to guard. Also, this deck is very dependent on counterblast for a lot of its bigger skills. Also, the deck loses to retiring. All these factors nerf what should be a very strong 6 attack deck into C tier. Now we enter into the average tier for decks. Decks here are just okay. They're not meta, but they're not bad either. At the bottom of B tier, we have Clarissa. This brawler deck lets you attack into an opponent's board for massive value. When this deck works, it goes off hard. It lets you restand at least 1 unit, draw some extra cards, and hit large numbers. The flip side to this is that the deck is really matchup dependent. Not every deck gets hit as hard by the board attack, which is a problem because all this deck's skills are on hit. Against a deck like Bruce that doesn't need to call anything, Clarissa does nothing. Also, this deck needs a specific 5 pieces to work. This opens up the deck to losing to retiring and other removes. Lastly, this deck has a very linear game plan, more so than any other deck on this list. Good when it works, meh when it doesn't. Pretty solid B tier deck. Next up we have Feltyrosa. Feltyrosa is a solid 5 attack deck that can increase the number of drive checks you get. This deck is counterblast dependent and can burn through its own resources somewhat quickly. It's live on turn 3, making it quite strong. The numbers are a bit low, and that combined with the other problems keep it below the higher tiers, but it's still a very solid strategy, putting it into B tier. Alright, now we have my favorite deck in the game, Eugene. Eugene can retire the opponent's board, draw 5 cards for free, and then call free units out of the deck. This is insanely strong in the right matchup when the opponent is constantly wanting to call out 5 rear guards. The biggest downside to this deck is that the deck's plays depend on playing around around your opponent, so a bad matchup can become an abysmal matchup. This deck is only a 3-attack deck, so it misses out on a lot of pressure. These factors put the deck into the very middle of B tier. Nirvana as a deck is a bit weird. On one hand, you have the best draw power in the game, combined with multi-attacking options in large numbers. On the other hand, you have a very fragile deck whose main mechanic and effects eat through resources at twice the rate of every other deck. The upsides are very strong for this deck, but those downsides are sometimes game, and Nirvana performs a lot better than every lower deck on this list, but it definitely needs some help and future support. Hexaorb finally gets a Persona Rite Searcher, who takes out a lot of the inconsistency of the deck out. Not only that, the deck is really the only deck outside of niche Touken Ranbu that can effectively stack triggers. This deck gets so much value for hitting a trigger. Lets you get like 30k power on a single trigger reveal. However, the trigger stack is a two-way street, and not seeing triggers in your stacking can leave this deck with nothing. Not only that, about every effect in this deck costs a Counterblast and a Soul Blast, making the deck struggle with resources. High B tier is what I give this deck. And in the highest B tier slot, we have Greedon. This deck's goal of restanding the Vanguard and buffing its attack to absurd numbers with guard restrict is super strong. However, at the end of the day, this deck is still only 3 attacks. 3 strong attacks, but still 3 attacks. The deck is also greedy for Counterblast, and Greedon skill costs the entire board. This surprisingly isn't all negative for the deck, as not having a lot of rear guards lets you battle handle decks like Eugene or Gravidia. While this deck certainly isn't lacking pressure, it's not as overwhelming as the higher decks on this list. Now we're moving on to A tier. Every deck here shows at least a fair bit of competitive viability. First off, we have Orfist. This deck is strong thanks to its early game rush and its jack of all trades toolbox style. This deck can call it a free board thanks to Orfist skill, and can save hand to better guard against certain decks. This deck can multi-attack or can pivot to a retired focused playstyle. While this is very strong, the lack of focus and its options really stops this deck from just steamrolling games. This deck forces you to choose between your best skills, and it doesn't feel nice to play. This deck wins its spot at the bottom of A tier thanks to its aggro and having some of the highest numbers in the game. Here we have Kairi, a bit of a controversial pick for A tier, but looking at the gameplay, the multi-attacking this deck can pull off is insanely strong. I can't stress enough how strong multi-attacking is. The deck can hit large numbers as well thanks to restanding rear guards. The only problems with this deck is it's only fully live turn 4, and this deck depends on unrecurrable pieces for its main combo. Also, some of the attacks in your combo will be a lot lower than what's wanted. This deck can easily blow a lot of the lower tiers out of the water if played right. Here we have a deck with the largest potential for the turn 3 pressure. On Nordlinger Ride, the deck gains 2 free draws and a soul charge too. But this deck can board wipe an opponent's board multiple turns in a row. More importantly, this deck gets double value off triggers, letting the deck ceiling if you're Saki become gigantic. This can knock out every deck in the game for no reason. And thanks to all the digging you do for meteors, this deck is more likely to hit triggers. But it is still a luck thing. If you don't see triggers, you are a 3-attack deck. Also, as of right now, the deck can only really fully nut once. You don't have recursion for meteors, so it's hard to send 5 from field to grave twice. This deck sacks its way into A tier. At the top of A tier, we have Baromagnes. Oh boy, you thought Kairi was a controversial pick. Let me just say this. 5 attacks, guard restrict, turn 3. Now, on top of that, add in decent aggro game and easy countercharging, and you have a meta deck. A lot of decks this format are focused on going to turn 4, and this deck can punish that severely. If you want an aggro option this format, this is what I recommend. But what really keeps this deck out of the top seats then? The answer is consistency. Breaking it down, this deck can hit 15 in soul on first grade 3 turn, about 75% of the time going first, and about 95% of the time going second. This consistency might be fine in a best 2 out of 3 format, but as we all know, in A, Vanguard is a best of 1, meaning one bad game ends everything. This deck can also lose to multiple defensive checks. Alright, now we're into the S tier decks. These decks are definitely stronger than the rest, but aren't quite as overpowering as the very top tier. First off, we have Seraph Snow. Seraph Snow is a deck that can aggro early, and more importantly, can punish your opponent for trying to counter aggro you. This deck can rip cards from your opponent's hand, and can imprison cards from the opponent's drop. Once this deck gets its new promo for imprisoning cards of top deck, this deck's position in S tier gets even more secure. This deck gets triple drive on turn 3 as well. This deck's only real problem is that some matchups can be kind of rough if you don't see your alternative imprisoning card. Next up, we have Bastion. Bastion has always been good because it's a super clean, large 4 attacks on turn 3. In set 3, they get a new grade 3 that gives itself drive checks for extra pressure. This combined with the deck's other tools let you finish out games more efficiently than ever. The plus 2k from Bastion skill lets your grade 3s hit over 5k if you go first, making this deck super toxic. Also, Halden is an insane value engine. The deck's only real problem is the low guard value early and some vulnerability to retiring. Now we're entering in the SS tier. These are decks that warp the format around them as they're just that good. Here we got Loronerol, which is just a nice clean 5 attacks, extra crit, guard restrict on the Vanguard, free extra guard, and we can't forget about the most important thing, a large amount of draw value. This is just an overwhelming amount of factors that just tower over every other deck this format. Like, the deck only has 2 half weaknesses as well. It can be slowed down a bit by retiring, and it needs to see the card 6 Flower Fractal for full combo. But thanks to the insane amount of draws this deck has, these weaknesses aren't really that major. If the deck goes first, it's very likely it's gonna win. Easy SS tier. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Bruce, the undisputed best deck in the game. This deck has at least 5 attacks combined with column wiping, being able to use the soul as a toolbox, extra draws, triple drive, and even the entirety of Eugene's skills, on a rearguard because fuck you. If this deck goes first, it's almost certain to win. Leonard punishes you for calling out a full board. Derek punishes you for not calling a full board. This deck puts every other deck into a lose-lose situation. It's insane. This deck gets the largest percentage of wins at every event for a reason. Its only real problem is that it's kind of vulnerable to aggro, but a good enough boost player can handle it and then kill immediately. This deck can counterblast starve you and then kill you from 1 damage. This deck doesn't need to call rearguards a full turn 4 against some matchups, and this deck has every answer, making it easily the best deck in the game. So what does this mean for the meta as a whole? The meta is very multi-attack based, as Vanguard always is. The meta decks are all dependent on going first, and the 2 best decks are focused on hitting off at turn 4, while a lot of rogue options are focused on going off on turn 5. The nations of Storkea and Dragon Empire are performing extremely poorly, while the nations of Dark States, Brant Gate, and Lyrical Monasteria are performing very well. Taking all this into account, I'm going to predict what deck will win BRO and the next Springfest. Out of the top 8 meta decks, I predict that we will see a Phantom Blaster Dragon undefeated sweep of every other deck! Thanks for watching this different style of video from what I normally do. Got some fun deck profiles coming up, so I'll see you then.